Hey, everybody. Was class supposed to start at 4?
Don't play that game with us, Craig.
I don't know. I was playing Squadrons that game with us. I was like, oh, wait, what time is it?
Now teach me networking.
Networking.
I don't know what we're supposed to be going over for this exam, so I really need some help today.
Please
so
don't
please
teach me networking.
please teach me what's on this exam and exactly what's on this exam and nothing that's not on this exam.
Oh, well, that's a little too much to ask. There are a few things on that study guide that I would like you to know, but I did not put on the exam, and I'm not telling you which ones.
Well, that makes me sad.
But there are 2 things that I didn't teach you that I have to go over today, so there's that. Let's see, which thing am I doing today? All right, that window looks good. Okay. Let me get my OBS set up. How is Squadrons worth the $40? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I played a whole lot of X-Wing and X-Wing versus TIE Fighter as a younger person. So there's a lot of nostalgia built up in there for me. And I can't necessarily say without that nostalgia that it would be worth $40, but I'm not even done with the story mode yet. Not as much a learning curve as like with a decent joystick and throttle. I've probably spent like an hour and a half messing with button mappings because there's a lot of stuff to do. It would be really nice if they allowed you to do multi-button mappings, like hold one button and hit another button to do this thing. Instead, they tried to stuff things into like command wheels, which is nice, but there's certain things like I would really like to do the energy shunting thing and map that over on top of the shield control stuff for like TIE fighters, which don't have shields. So even like profiles where different buttons for different ships would be really nice. I did post the study guide, if by study guide you mean like a list of bullet points of things to study. It's in midterm topics. Let me get this pulled up. Overwatch doesn't even have that many buttons. Like, what are you talking about? This thing's got like, I have like a 15 button joystick and throttle, and I still have to leave things off because they don't let me do like hold this button as a shift key to hit other buttons. That was the only way I could use this thing for Elite Dangerous, and apparently without that, I just have too many buttons. Yeah. There are so many different, so yeah. Everything's due this week because Clemson wants midterm like grades turned in for like everything by the end of the week. So I'm gonna have to get you guys like your grade in my class for everybody, including the midterm and any projects that have been turned in so far. I'm gonna have to get all of those grades finalized into you guys by like Friday sometime. So I'm probably gonna be spending Wednesday night and Thursday night just grading exams, but it's not going to be as bad as previous years. Your time management is awful. So is mine. I mean, you saw me show up late to class. Hold on, I got somebody messaging me from work. Okay, screen share. Where are we? Oh, wait, I need to. Nope, that's not going to work yet. I'm getting there. There we go. All right. So here's the midterm topics. I'll go over this, and you should be able to see the right answers to the quizzes. So I'm going to go over that last if we have time. But before I go over all this stuff, there's one set of this thing right here. I feel like I haven't even talked about. I think we got into some promises stuff, but we didn't talk about how catches and thens branch, and we did talk about how to modify what gets passed along, right? That's just returning different things. Where's my chat at? I lost my chat. Where'd it go? Are you kidding me? I don't have chat now. Oh, there it is. Okay. There we go. So, and then timings, if you understand how promises work, yeah, I know it sucks. And it's not even a button. You have to click the more thing, which is super annoying. But I clicked it twice and it just popped up behind a window, which is great. So this timing stuff, it should kind of be self-evident if you understand that it's using callbacks and stuff like that. But let's just talk about this a little bit. So where is my Sublime? Are there any other questions before we get started on getting into this stuff? No. Where's my damn screen? Where's my Sublime? Is this it? Yeah, this is it. Okay. So let's set some JavaScript syntax in here. All right, so let's say we do like an Axios call, something that returns a promise. We don't really have to worry about what, something, and we'll just say like let P equal Axios, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter what we're doing in here. It's going to return us a promise. All right. And then we do dot then, and we have our first function, and let's just make this something super easy, like don't even really need to take any information in. Let's call it response. And this is our function definition, if I can type. And I want to do set timeout. So you guys remember what set timeout does, right? You pass in a function and we'll call that function in whatever. So we're going to pass in some function. And then I'll fill that out in a second. And then we want it to run this function after like 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds. Okay. So inside here, we want to console.log and set timeout. All right. And then we want to return response.data. Remember, this is going to go into the next thing. So if we do another dot, then I guess I need a P at the front of this. So this would be, we can put this all together if we want. We can make it work like that if we want to. Maybe that's a little bit easier to understand. So we have this Axios call, then we have these dot thens afterwards. Let's indent this just to make it a little easier to read. And we have another dot then. And this one's just going to take in data, which is what we returned from the last one. Remember, we could call this whatever we want. We can call it ASDF, but it's still going to be the contents of this thing because that's what the previous one returned. Don't ask me why we're waiting 1,000 milliseconds to call this. It's just to prove a point. It's not because it's like a good idea, right? There's no reason to wait at all. You could just have this outside of that code and it would run just fine. But then we want to console.log data is whatever that data thing is. Okay, and let's put one more. All right, so let's call this number 1. Let's call this number 2. And let's call this number 3. What order will these show up in your console? Anybody want to take a guess? Oh, we got a bunch of different answers. So we have 1, 2, 3. We have a 2, 1, 3. We have a 1, 3, 2. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You are, the ones that said 132 are correct. This code inside here, this is another callback. So it will register this callback and it'll say, all right, in 1 second, I will run this code in here. And so it's just gets to the end of this line. It has registered the callback, and then it will immediately move on to returning the data, which will immediately call this. So it'll call this right away. Well, as far as right away being like when Axios returns us data, right? So as soon as Axios gives us data, it'll say, hey, I got a response. And then it'll register this callback to happen 1,000 milliseconds later. It will return the data. Then it'll say what the data is. And then after that 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds, it'll come back and run this bit of code. So all of this stuff in a dot then happens as soon as you get data. And as soon as you return here, it'll go to the next one. And this is not like a wait. This is not the equivalent of like a sleep 1,000, right? Like this, not the same as set timeout, right? So if we did it like in C or Python or something like that, we did a sleep 1,000, it would actually pause execution here, right? And it would do that sleep, and then it would move on to the next line. But because JavaScript does not like that whole sleep thing, it's like, all right, well, I've registered this callback, I've started the timer clock, and I'm moving on to the next line of code, this thing here. So let's see if I know what I'm saying here. I'm actually going to make my own promise. You guys don't know how to do this, but I don't feel like getting Axios into my browser right now. So new promise, what is it? Resolved and reject. This needs an extra thingy around it. And it'll immediately call this. Okay, that's not the right way to do it. I'm getting there. Okay. Got to get my shit together. Okay. I'm going to do set timeout. Let's do like 2 seconds. And let's do loop. Like this. And then we call resolve. And we put in some stuff like data. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So this, and let's set this as like constant. I don't even need to set it. All right. So this should do what we want. Let's go find out. This is why my homies hate JS. Tabs and spaces, gang. Come on, man. We're all doing tabs here. We're all friendly. Everybody likes tabs here. Do you need a comma between? Yes, I do. I do indeed. Good call. Zach's like, hey, super helpful comment. And Nathan's like, hey, you should have let him burn. All right, let's go back to the browser and let's just try and see if this does what I think it does or if I'm bad at writing code on the fly after being late to class. 1, 2, bloop, bloop, and bloop. Hey, it works. So it waited 2 seconds because that's what I put. Let's expand this out. So it immediately returned this promise, which is the promise that was returned after all these dot thens. So this promise, for example, if I were to run this code again, and I were to set this to p equals, right? Is this p the first promise or the last promise? Like if I take p and I go all the way down to the, okay, too far. P equals, so I have all this code, and then a couple lines later, I'm like p dot then, and I just put like, I'm another promise in here. Like I'm a little teapot, right? Does this get run? So like, where does this dot then get attached? This one right here. Does it get attached to this promise here? Or does it get attached at the very end down here after this dot then? Yep, it appends. So this promise, this thing that we save into P, it is not this thing. It is the buildup of this plus all of the dot thens that happen afterwards. So let's run this again. We wait our 2 seconds, then promise resolves. We say, got a response, data is 1, 2, 3, I'm a teapot, and then it's in set timeout. Anybody have any questions about how the timing of that stuff works, how that flows, right? Anybody confused about why set timeout is not where it is in the code, but it's kind of way after everything else? Nope. Okay. So I bring this up because I was writing the midterm and realized that I wanted to put a question about this onto the midterm, and I hadn't taught it yet. So very obvious hint to anybody paying attention. Something like this will probably be on the midterm on Wednesday. You might want to be able to understand it. Okay. I'm just saying. Say that again. Which part am I saying again? Pro tip. This is going to be on the midterm. Okay, where is my Sublime window? Okay, here we go. It's kind of like the quizzes. There's going to be a little bit more freeform stuff. So I think I experimented a little bit with like a fill in the blank style question, which is just short answer, I think. I don't think, I can't remember if this is this specific style of question, something akin to this question, if I made it a multiple choice or if I made it I think I made it a fill in the blank, like say 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, or 1, 3, just say the order of the way things will happen. I think that's how I did it. So it's more freeform answers, which means I'm going to have to go in and actually grade some stuff. But it's not going to be as bad as previous years where I actually had like pen and paper midterms and finals. So that was kind of a pain because I actually had to like break out a pen and spend like 4 hours grading stuff. Okay, so we have this promise here. Don't need to know how to do this. This part is not important. I haven't really talked about what the hell this is doing, but keep in mind that your promise can either resolve or reject. This is important. And each one of these new .thens also makes a new promise. And any promise can resolve or reject. And by reject, I mean it fails. I didn't want to use Axios because I would have had to like include Axios in the console when I pasted in the browser when I pasted this stuff in. I didn't have Axios on my Canvas page where I was playing with the JavaScript console, so I just made my own promise. But it works the same way, right? Like any promise you return, whether it's going to have data in it or whether you just make up fake data and tell it to resolve, it's all kind of going to work the same way. For the purposes of learning how to attach stuff to promises, later on we're going to have to, for the next project, not project, what are we on 4 now? For project 5, when we're doing Redis and React, I mean, not React, Redis and some other stuff in the REST API and all that stuff, it may be beneficial to know how to make promises, or at least how to take multiple promises and bind them together into a new one. But we'll get to that then. Don't worry about it. It's not going to be on the midterm. One thing you do need to know is the idea of like a promise that resolves or like calls a dot then versus a promise that errors or calls a catch. Okay, so just talking about, this is actually short for resolve, and this is short for reject with 1 E. So we actually told this promise that we wanted it to resolve itself, and we wanted it to resolve and pass out that data. We could instead reject it and maybe have like error 1, 2, 3. And so let's just change this around. I'm switching to the other thing that I didn't teach you guys, which is error handling. So when you reject something, if you don't do anything with it, this should all, let me actually change this to error. Okay, so let's run this, and I believe it will actually like throw an error directly into the console. Like your code will just, wait for it. Okay, uncaught. So it bubbled all the way through our dot thens. It didn't find any catches. And since it didn't find any catches, yep, you're right, can't see, okay? So this is me pasting in the code, and then I ran it. That returned a promise it was pending after 2 seconds. And just run this all again. Takes 2 seconds, and then it says uncaught in promise, and here's the error. So it actually, I made an error object. I just put like error 123 in it, but it's, you know, when you reject, everything's an error object. So it waited 2 seconds. It threw an error out of the promise. None of our dot thens were able to catch that error, so it didn't call any of our dot thens. It skipped all the way down to the end, and by the time it got to the end, it still didn't find any catches. So it was just like, well, hell, I guess I'll just throw like an actual like top level, this is an error for the browser to see. So if we go back to our code, and I were to put a dot catch right here, and catches work the same way. So this is a dot catch. It works the same way as a dot then. Wait, so you said, wait, so if the reject was a resolve, then the dot thens would execute immediately. No. So the difference between the way we have it now and the way we had it was this was resolving. So meaning like when you resolve, it follows all of the dot thens. When you reject, it goes to the first catch, skipping all the dot thens. And then like if you caught it correctly, I'll explain. I think this will work. But catches and thens all work the same time. They all start as soon as it's resolved. So we waited 2 seconds. We either resolved it or we rejected it. And at that point, all of these chained things, whether they're dot thens or catches, are going to be executed in a specific order. So normally if you have like error, let's say error starts here in promise, right? So we have this thing. Let's call this a promise. And let's say inside this thing, we have an error. And then we have a dot then, we have a dot catch, and we have another dot then we have another dot catch. So if the error starts inside the promise, which is not the only place, you can also create errors inside the dot then, which I'll talk to in a minute. So let's say the error starts inside the promise, which is what we were doing here. We were simulating an error. So this would be like if Axios found something that was a 404 or something like that, or like a 500 internal server error, it may create a rejected promise instead of, it may reject the promise it created is the better way to say it, because it's already created the promise before it even goes to talk to the web server. This promise gets created and then it waits 2 seconds and then it either, right now it's rejecting, but it could also resolve. So it's like, I've already created a promise. Now, after I've done whatever asynchronous stuff, whether it's talking to the server, or just waiting 2 seconds, or whatever you want this promise to do, when you have an answer, you either call your reject function or call your resolve function, and that rejects or resolves the promise that gets returned by this block of code. So if we catch here, so this would be skipped. Let me go back down to this pseudocode example. Skipped. And then this one handles the promise and handles the error. And once it's handled, then it goes back to normal execution. So then this would be run. And unless there's any other errors that happen, this would be skipped. So it skips all of your dot thens until it finds, when it's in an error state, it will skip every dot then until it finds something that can handle that error state, which is your dot catch. After that, it will continue on through all your .thens and it won't call any catches. This is what actually tells the promise to proceed with the .thens and the catches. We're just telling it if we wanted to, we could get rid of all of this set timeout code and it would immediately reject or resolve. But we're simulating something like we want it to be a little asynchronous. We want it to like wait 2 seconds, just like a network transaction might take like 500 milliseconds or something like that. So that's why I have a set timeout in here. I'm just like, wait 2 seconds and then blue. Yes, this would be skipped. This .then here is going to be skipped. And so I'm going to actually show this in code in a second, but I'm just going to up here, but I'm just going to go with the theory a little bit down here. If it's whatever state it's in, it's going to skip all of the stuff that doesn't pertain to that state. So .then, those handle resolved states. Catches handle rejected states. So right now, right before it runs this .then, it's in an errored state. It's in a rejected state. So error starts in promise is rejected, right? So the promise is rejected here. So it gets here and it's like a .then cannot handle a rejected promise. So I'm going to skip down and it's like a .catch that can handle a rejected promise. This .catch resolves it. After a rejected state, do you have to reassign resolve? No. You can either throw another error inside this catch or you can return some data that then gets handled by the next one. So here, let's say we're rejecting with error 123. Inside here, I want to say console.log, and this will make more sense as like I move some code around up here, and it'll make a little bit more sense, hopefully. Caught an error. And let's just say what the error is. And so this is error. All right, so this object right here, we're taking in this error object. It's going to be this whole curly bracket with error : 123 inside of it. That's what's going to come in here. And then if we return error.error, that's what's going to come in here. And I'm betting it will break here. And then this won't get run. So let's walk through what this, let's run it and then walk through what happens. So let's switch back to the browser. All right, so we're waiting our 2 seconds. Oh, console is not defined. Okay, well that was not what I thought would happen, but okay. It's because I can't spell console right. All right, so inside the catch, it actually threw another error and it threw it all the way out, which is awesome. This is probably going to continue to be a little confusing until I move some stuff around. All right, so we're going to run this code. We'll wait 2 seconds, caught an error, and then we returned and it said got a response and it actually didn't error. Okay, so it just got an undefined key and all right. So let's copy this out and let's go back to Sublime. And down here, here's what actually happened. We can get rid of all this crap. That's the other half of the console that was on the right side. We don't need any of that. No, don't need that either. Error, blah. So this is all in the same line. Okay, so this line 32 here, this is from that. So we waited our 2 seconds, right? So we had 2 second wait. And then we rejected an error, rejected the promise. And then we ran this catch here, or it ran this catch because the promise was in a rejected state. And then we said we caught something and we said what we caught, which was this object with error : 123 in it. And then we returned error : 123. So inside here, this response, this is just 123. And actually let's rerun this with that, okay? So let's rerun this and actually make sure we know what we're talking about. Waiting, Called an error, got a response, data is undefined, and set timeout. Okay, so back to Sublime. All right, so this now says that, right? So here we were like, we called an error and then we returned something. That return means that this catch is now okay. It has now basically set the promise back to a resolved state from a rejected state. So if you do anything inside this catch, except for so pretty much everything you do inside this catch, when this catch is done, JavaScript assumes that the promise is now in a resolved state. The only way to keep it in a rejected state after you run your catch code is throwing a new error. How do I do a throw? I think that'll work. So if we do this throw here, so without this throw, let's leave this commented out. It is now in a resolved, instead of rejected, it is now in a resolved state by the time this catch ends. And then it happily runs through the rest of our .thens, and it uses what we returned here as the input to the next thing. So we returned error.error, which is just 1, 2, 3, right? So we caught an error, this whole error object that we passed in here, we logged it here, which is this object that has one key value pair. The key is error, the value is 1, 2, 3. At the very bottom of the catch, we returned error.error, which is just this value 1, 2, 3. So inside here, it said got a response, and the response that was passed into it was just the key 1, 2, 3. So far, so good. Down here, we did a response.error. This is undefined. There is no .error on the number 1, 2, 3. And so data is undefined at the very bottom. So we've kind of peeled off layers of this object. We resolved something. We used catch to return something that was an error into resolve. Now, if we were to, let's say, copy this and move it down here. So now it will not run this first thing because it currently, after the promise, it is in a rejected state. So this first .then is not going to happen. It's going to go straight to this error. And let's just see how this works. Let's clear this out, make it a little easier to read. Yep, and a promise, and then it said caught an error, and data is 1, 2, 3. There was no set timeout because it skipped that whole .then that set the set timeout. It doesn't actually say what the response is. So if we look at this, it just said caught an error and data is 1, 2, 3. So let's go back to Sublime and figure out why it did that, right? So that was the first time through. The second time through, it said caught an error. It did not get a response, and data is 1, 2, 3, and it did not call set timeout. So that's the difference, right? We skipped this entire function here because we didn't have a catch yet. So it was still in a rejected state. We skipped all the way over this thing. But then once we caught it, we were good to go to move on to the next one. Okay, so let's do both. And I'm going to keep this throw thing commented out. And I'm going to return response.error.something else. Okay, so this is going to be even more fun. Because like I said, promises aren't the only thing that can cause errors. If something goes wrong inside of a .then, it will convert it back to a rejected promise. Just like catches can convert it to a resolved promise, errors in a .then will convert it to a rejected promise. So when we run this code, let's see what happens. We wait. It caught an error. It got a response. It caught another error, which is type error response.error is undefined. Yeah. And then it said data is undefined and set timeout. Does that sort of make sense? We actually caused a second error inside our .then, And let's look at why data is undefined here. So if we go back to Sublime, it said here that data is undefined. Well, the error that we got here was an actual, let's go back and look at it. It is a type error, response.error is undefined. And if we look at that, I think it's just a type error. I think it's just a string. It certainly doesn't have the key we were looking for on it. It certainly doesn't have, back to this, it certainly does not have this error.error. I mean, that doesn't exist. It probably has some other stuff on it, but nothing that matches this. So we tried to return this thing, the type error that we caught here. So this caught a type error. And it caught a type error because we tried to reference something that didn't exist on something that didn't exist, right? So all this stuff caused the error. So instead of skipping over this catch, it ran this catch because it's now in an errored state. It's in a rejected state again. But this is a JavaScript error, right? Like this is a built-in JavaScript error. Hey, type error, you can't do that. You can't ask for like dot something when you're already looking at undefined. So like response.error.something, it's like, there's no dot something on an undefined. What are you talking about? No, throw an error. So JavaScript threw this error. Whereas up here, we threw our own error. We rejected of our own accord. We created our own like custom error object. We knew it was going to be in it. That was awesome. Okay. Now let me just look at one other thing real quick. I'm going to pull this over to the other browser so you can't see it. I need to look at the question that I have on the midterm and make sure. Where is the midterm? Please tell me I didn't delete it. Oh, there it is. Okay. Edit. Because there's one other part that I want to touch on, but we're already at 4:43, so yep, that's fine. Where's the other one? Okay, all right, so I don't have to talk about other thing because it's not on the midterm. Lucky you guys. The one thing I will tell you kind of what it is, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Screen share. Nope. Can't see the screen. Yeah, I know. All right, so one other thing that I want to point out is you can have two things inside of a dot then. So instead of doing dot then and then dot catch and then dot then and then dot catch, the way I have it written right now, this is the safer way to do it. The other way to do it though is you can have another function inside this dot then. You can have two function pointers. So way down here, you can have a dot then with a function inside of it. Or you can have a dot then with two functions inside of it. So this is the resolve function, and this is the reject function. So instead of doing a catch and, yep, totally in Sublime again. All right, so you can have a dot then that just has one function, and you can have a dot catch that just has another function. You can have both. You can put both of them into the dot then. But it's not a great idea because it will only, if, for example, you cause an error inside this dot then, the next dot catch will catch it. If you cause an error inside this resolve function, this reject function won't catch it. So it's like putting two of them side by side in the chain, right? Like it's not putting one after the other. So it's always better to do this than to do this. But if you see this, you at least understand what it means, but don't worry, you're not going to see this part. You're not going to see this part here on the midterm. Don't worry about it. But this is better anyway. I just want you to know it exists. Okay. Any questions about that before I go back to this midterm thing? Well, feel free to ask questions at any point. Okay, You all know the URL formats and parts, right? So, you know, you have like the protocol, you have the host name, which could also be an IP address. You have a colon port somewhere in there, possibly. And then you have a path. And then you have your get stuff, your get variables. So if I go back over here, we have all, you know, you have your HTTP. This part's just the protocol, right? And we have your host name or IP, right? And then you can have a port, maybe. So you can have colon port number, or you can have no port number. It doesn't really matter. Either way, you have a path after post, right? So you have this on both of them. You have a question mark, and you have some var and something else, right? This works. And then you also have this hashtaggy thing, and it's like even more stuff after the hashtag, right? So all that works. You kind of need to know what all those parts are. You need to know that this is the protocol or the schema. You need to know that this is the host name or IP address. You need to know that the port comes with the colon before it and also comes before the path. You need to know when I say path that I don't mean all this stuff. The path is just this part right here. Then you have a question mark, and then you have some get variables. And you also need to know that this part never gets sent to the server. This hashtag, if I were to type this into the browser, the parts of the packet it's going to build, right? So let's see. If we just have, let's delete this. So what packet would this build, right? Well, we know it's going to create some TCP connection. We aren't specifying a port, so it's going to create a connection to port 80 because of HTTP protocol, and to port 80 of hostname.or.ip, right? So this is all. Which part did you say the path doesn't include again? The path is only the stuff right here. So it does not include the question mark or any of this stuff, but this question mark and these things, which are called get variables, these do get included in the packet that gets sent to the web server. But if I ask you what the host name of this, or what the path of this URL is, it is only these things. It is only /path/after/host. Is the additional dot part of the host name? Yes, the host name is all of the things between these two slashes. And if you had a port number here, that will get sent in the host header. All of this stuff will get sent in the host header, but I'm pretty sure this is your host name, just this part. So if I ask for where the port is, yes, example.com.example.com is the host name, yes. But fun fact, I can have path.com here. Just because it has a .com in it or a period in it, it can still be a path because positionally it's after that first slash. Like everything between these slashes is part of the host name and the port. None of this stuff really, it kind of goes into the packet, but it's not really part of the basic HTTP packet. It just goes into a host header. So let's go down here. Let's build this out. So because HTTP protocol, so it's going to go to port, and let's just put 80 in here just to be consistent, right? So we're telling it to go to port 80. If we get rid of it, it'll still go to port 80 because that's the default. But this whole thing is the host name, so it will do DNS lookup of this and use the returned IP adder, right? So this is the TCP packet it's going to make. Inside that TCP packet, it's going to have an HTTP packet. Now, this is a GET request. This is a GET request because we're assuming you just copy paste this into your URL bar in a browser, your URL bar will automatically, just because you put something into the URL bar, it'll just make itself do a get. Most of the time, you're only going to see a post or something like that if you actually have a form that says method post in it, which, by the way, you're going to need to know forms, but we'll get to that in a second. So get, and then the path /path.com/after/host ? So yes, it puts the whole path in there, but it also puts all of this other stuff in there. All of this goes into the first line of the HTTP packet, and then we have HTTP/1.1. Okay. Notice this is never going to be sent in any part of the packet. This part up at the top, not going to be in the packet. Something that may be in the packet is a host header, which the browser will be like, hey, you were looking for hostname.or.ip, and then it might have some other stuff like content type, content length. You don't need to know any of these. There might be a cookie if you've talked to this site before. So all that stuff will be in there. And there's 1, 2, 3, whatever that is. Content type, I don't know, like HTML, I don't know. And then that's the end of the packet. If we were doing a post, there would be more stuff. But right now, this is all the packet would be. So the protocol, the host name, none of that stuff gets put into this first line. The only thing that gets put into this first line is the stuff after the host name and port, all the way through to the end or the beginning of that hashtag thing. And yes, modern browsers, the point of hashtag even more stuff. So normally when you're in Wikipedia and you're looking at the table of contents and you click on one of the things in the table of contents and it just scrolls your browser down to a certain point on the page without like reloading the page, let's go look at that. Let me see if I can find Wikipedia that does that. So we go to Squadron. Okay, well, that's not right. Star Wars Squadrons, that's better. Okay, so if we look at this thing here, down at the very bottom of my screen, a very hard to read thing, but you can just watch this URL bar here. When I click on plot, it puts hashtag plot at the top. And then it scrolls you directly to the plot thing. But it does not reload the page. It just looks for inspect element. It looks for something with ID equal plot. So it just scrolls to the top of the page or scrolls into view, depending on your browser. If I were to put, plot in there, that's fine. If I were to type release into there and hit enter, it scrolls to the release part of the page. And you can just like bloopity bloop, and that's all it does. Now, for our project, we're actually like taking advantage of that because we know it'll never be sent to the server. So it's a way to, you can hijack that to send error messages from the server back to the browser. So while this part here in Sublime, this even more stuff never gets sent to the server can absolutely create a redirect and say like 302 redirect location, this thing. So I can still do a redirect to exactly where I want or something like that. That still works fine. The server can send the hashtags back as like a redirect or something, but they just never get sent to the server. Okay. So browser scene. Parts of HTTP request and response methods, method, path, get and post variables, headers. I hope you guys have kind of understood most of that. If not, there's stuff. There's not what stuff. There's HTML basics or HTTP. This is actually pretty useful. You might want to just, not the RFC, probably not, but the Wikipedia page for HTTP would probably be a useful thing to read if you're a little confused about what part of a packet is the method, what part is the path, where get variables go in a packet, and where post variables go in a packet. Remember, post variables are at the bottom. Get variables are the things we saw after the question mark. They go on that top line. Okay. Cider ranges. Just know how to do cider ranges. Like, you know, which parts, what does it mean if you convert a cider to a subnet? Like, what does that slash do to make a subnet, right? What is the number, the slash number? Does that mean that many bits are going to be changing inside this range that you made, or that many bits will stay the same inside this range you made? Like, if I do slash 24, does it mean that the first 24 bits are going to be unchanging inside this range? Or does it mean the last 24 bits are going to be unchanging inside this range? So you can, yeah. So, or does it mean that 24 bits will be changing inside this range? Just go back and read up on Cider. Ubuntu EC2 instances, okay, like how do you SSH? Do you use the Ubuntu user or do you use EC2 user? Where do you find the files for Apache, right? Like, so the Etsy Apache 2 folders or the Etsy Nginx folders, those config files. Logs, we talked about logs. We haven't really looked into them too much, but /var/log, you can find all of these things. They're all on your operating system. Comp files and the default document root. Please tell me you guys know where and don't tell me it's in the home folder, because we create a symlink so that we don't have to put stuff in the real document root, because we need sudo to do that, but it's var www.html, right? Okay. Service files, the Nginx service files. Just go read why and what we did for those. Proxy blocks to Nginx comp files. Again, that's kind of straightforward. npm start and environment variables. So in project 4, we have that npm start instead of just calling node directly. And when we do npm start, it actually puts the, reads the package.json and puts the environment variables in there. You guys, hopefully that you can read about this in the project 4 write-up. We just had a quiz on this one. Package.json. When you npm install a package with --save, it writes it into your package.json. If you delete all your packages, like all the node module stuff, and then you just do npm install, it'll just go and install all the stuff that your package.json file says. HTML forms, inputs, buttons. So inputs and let's see, buttons. We did a whole bunch of stuff in like tic-tac-toe using buttons. HTML forms, we talked a little bit about that last week, and your next project is involving it. Inputs, we also talked a little bit about that. You don't need to know too much about inputs, but like maybe the difference between like a text input and a password input, and which ones, like, you know, okay, so is it the name or is it the ID of the input that tells the form what the key value pairs are? Does that make sense? Let me go back to Sublime and see if I can pull up project 4 redacted, index.html. So remember this form here. What you need to know, like, what does this do? What if I do this? What's the difference between a get and a post? What does this part do? This tells you tells the form where it's going to send this get or a post. But this also, it doesn't just make it a get or a post. It also moves in the packet where all these variables get sent. What variables, you might ask? Well, each of these inputs creates a variable, a key value pair in the packet that eventually gets either posted or submitted by get or whatever. So right now we're doing a post. So it reads through the form reads through all of the stuff that's inside of it and says, okay, well, I have this input and it's got a name, user ID. So I'm going to make a key value pair. The key is going to be user ID. The value is going to be whatever's in this text box right now. I got another one. Here's another name attribute on an input. It's called name, which isn't confusing to my point right now at all. But we have this name, and its value would be whatever the value of this text input is. So if you type, Craig B into this text field, the key value pair will be user ID Craig B. If you type Craig Baker into this name input field, the key will be name and the value will be Craig Baker. If I type, ASDF into this thing, then it'll be password : ASDF. That'll be the key value pair. I don't think it's a colon. It'll actually be like the ampersand thing. This one gets skipped because it does not have a name attribute. So this one, it's not called user ID. When it's building up the key value pairs, it doesn't use the ID of this input. It uses the name attribute of this input. This is something you should probably remember. So if you study how this form works, and if you try to write this form, that will get you a long way to it. You kind of need to also like study what your browser does in the network tab. Like if you click this form and you fill out all the stuff and you click submit, what is your browser actually, what packet is it actually sending? Where does it put the data? What does the data look like? The key value pairs, their URL and URI component encoded, which just means it's got the ampersands between them and the equal signs for the key value pairs, right? Trying to go a little bit quick here. Okay, this is old news, passed by value versus passed by reference. Know which types are passed by value and which types are passed by reference and what that means, that they don't get copied or whatever. JS scoping, scope chains, closures, hoisting. We've talked about all that stuff before. If you have any questions about this, hit me up. I think some of the quizzes go over these as well. So read through the quizzes and the correct answers on the quizzes. And if you're still confused about why some of those things were wrong, let me know. Const, let, and var. You need to know the difference of these. This is really easy to play around with in your browser. You can pretty much figure it out. There's only a couple things like const you can't reassign. Let is just a better version of var, and let doesn't prevent you from accidentally doing hoisting. If you know all of the words that I just said and are nodding, then you will be fine. If you are like, wait, var prevents hoisting, wait, what's hoisting? You might need to go back and read on that. Closures, remember we talked about that. It's about you create a function, create a variable inside the function, return a second function. Because that variable was created inside the scope chain where that function was created, bloop, the inner function now has access to it. Waiting for page to load before accessing document stuff in client-side files. This means like window.add-event-listener to run your init function instead of just like in bare code being like document.getElement by ID. God, I hope this doesn't cause a race condition. Yeah, don't do that. You probably need to know kind of how and why somebody would put the first thing that goes to the page and says like, hey, document, get me all these things by ID, or tries to add stuff to the page using document. You need to know kind of how and why, and remember like just the general idea of like, we need to wait for the browser to tell us we're ready before we do stuff with the document, reading or writing. XHR and AJAX and how it differs from form submissions. The main difference is like the page doesn't reload in XHR AJAX. You can think of XHR and AJAX as just Axios. This is what we do with Axios, where the JavaScript's initiating a request, telling the browser to send like a back channel request to the server, gets an answer back. The browser does not reload the page, doesn't go talk to another page, doesn't do a form submission where it's like, let me send this to the server and the server's going to give me something new to put in the browser and I'm going to load up this new thing. Okay. Using promises, we've gone over that just today. Arrow notation functions versus regular function. There's two main differences besides the syntax. There's two main differences between arrow notation functions and regular functions. It's that you can't really change the scope of arrow notation functions. You can't change it later. It will always be the scope that it was created in. The .this does not get changed when you attach it to new buttons. The regular function, you can attach it to 50 buttons. When you click those buttons, the this dot blah will always be whatever buttons it's attached to. Arrow notation functions, they don't let you do that. They're like, nope, I'm always the scope that I was created in. Sorry, buddy. Also, arrow notations, you can't use that arguments keyword to get a list of all the arguments were passed into it. Remember the arguments thing where you're like, hey, I didn't define any arguments in the parentheses of my function, but I can just call arguments keyword and it'll give me a nice long array of all the stuff that was passed into my function. Can't do that with arrow notation. Express routing, so static routes. Static routes are like the time route in Project 3. It was just like /time. And if anybody types in exactly /time, I want you to run this code. Routes with variables. This is like in our current project. I think we have something like that. Let me check. server.js, user exists, user info. Do we not have any variables? User auth? Oh shit. Okay. Yep. I was just looking to see if I could find it before I pulled you guys over. Okay, so instead of user exists, this to use a variable would be user, maybe like we would call it maybe exists and then colon username. So if we were to write something like this with a colon in it, this colon part is going to be pulled out as a variable. So if I were to do get, because remember it's a get right here. So if I were to send get slash exists slash Craig B, or get slash exists slash, I don't know, someone else, then rec dot params dot Craig B, or no, rec dot params dot username equals Craig B. And this one would be someone else. And there's one other gotcha, and this is why we did not use this for the project. Remember, I wanted you guys to catch the wildcard thing. I wanted you to do a app.get star or something like that. And some of y'all just said, all right, well, let me just do colon path. And I saw this, and I think I got most of you to change your mind and resubmit. But if you do this, and I do a get to slash pat or slash, you know, this is a path. Rec.params ms.path, because that's the name that we had in the colon here, right? Just like this is username, it creates the username variable. This one's path, so in params it creates a path variable, but it's only going to grab this. It's not going to be the rest of this stuff, because when you write variables, you can do colon second path. See how that works? So it actually allows you, it stops and dumps it into the variable as soon as it finds the next slash, which is why for the project, I wanted you guys, and this was project 3, so I wanted you guys to use that. In this project, for project 4, we actually aren't using any variables in our URL, but doesn't, I mean, it's a fairly, this is pretty much all there is to it. It's not super fancy. I'm not going to ask too many questions beyond like something like this. If I even ask something like this. Like I said, some of the stuff on here might be a red herring. I'm not telling you which. That's it. That's all the midterm topics. And we have 5 minutes left. If anybody has any further questions, you have 5 minutes now. If people start dropping, I'm also going to dip out, and hit me up on Slack if you have any questions while studying over the next like 36 hours or 48 hours or 47 hours or whatever. Yep. Just during class time, next class, correct. And that's all the class is going to be. So if you get done with it, feel free to dip out early. I really don't expect it'll take you guys, there's always 1 or 2 people that it takes like an hour to do this, but most of the time it's like 30 minutes. Is there, I think I'm just going to have it unlocked directly at 4. Yeah, probably shouldn't unlock it at 5. So no, there won't be a code. But I will be in the Zoom channel. If anybody has any questions, I'll be chilling on Zoom. Just like the teacher sitting at the front of the class. Is it open notes? No, no notes, no Google, no chatting with friends. I don't really care if you're on Zoom or not. And Dan, don't ask me how I'm going to enforce that. Y'all too. Y'all have a good one. Yep.